Reach Young Adult Ministry sermons online from Tuesday, March 8th, 2022 by Taylor Gabbert, pastor to college students at Evergreen Baptist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, entitled Ravens, Widows, and Wadis from 1 Kings 17.
There is a stirring.
So, my name is Taylor Gabbert, if you don't know me. As Philip so eloquently put it, every now and again I get a good one, so let's hope tonight is that night. Come on, okay. Right now at Reach, we're in the year of service. So Philip just taught through 1 Timothy, and part of the theme of that book is Paul writing to Timothy to tell him how to serve God, how to be a servant of God in the ministry. So tonight we're going to talk about Elijah. And over the next 3 weeks, we're going to detail the life and work of Elijah before Elisha comes on the scene, to look at what serving God looks like in one person, in a specific character in the Old Testament. And I've titled this sermon, Ravens, Widows, and Wadis. What we're going to see is that God faithfully provides for his servants, and he's not confined to provide for his servants in the ways that we typically think of. He can do it however he chooses to do it. So if you don't know about Elijah, let me give you some background. There is no background. We don't know much about Elijah. He just kind of appears stage left on the scene. He comes in at a moment in history and interjects what God's will is in that moment. So instead of talking about Elijah's background, since we don't have it, we're going to talk about the historical setting that leads to Elijah's sudden appearance. So we got to back up. 2 Samuel ends, and David is king, and things are pretty good. And then in 1 Kings, there's a transition from David to his son Solomon. And Solomon is told by God that God will bless him as long as he walks with God. Now, I need you to keep in mind, God doesn't trade works for blessings, okay? I don't want you to take that away from that statement, because God isn't in the business of trading his blessings for the good things you do. The way that it works is that God blesses those he is in a relationship with. So if relationships, what are they characterized by? Faithfulness, or you could say exclusivity. It's like when you make it official, right, on Facebook, because that's how it really becomes official. You are in an exclusive relationship. You are, Philip liked that one. When you are in an exclusive relationship with God and you're faithful, then he blesses you. Now don't hear that wrong either. It's not the health and wealth gospel. The blessings of God often are God's presence, God himself, right? So I'm not talking about money or sports cars, although if you read the life of Solomon, he kind of had that. I mean, whatever the equivalent of sports cars was back then, like camels or something. But he was very blessed, okay? So God blesses those that are in relationship with him, and he doesn't bless those that are not in relationship with him, like true blessings, right? And you might say, well, what if I'm a Christian? What if I'm already in relationship with God, but I'm sinning? Well, God doesn't give you the benefits of being in relationship with him when you're not behaving like you're in a relationship with him. Now, he doesn't leave you because our God is patient and loving and kind, but he doesn't bless you in the same way when you're acting unfaithfully towards him, right? So, and God, by the way, he doesn't let you be comfortable in rebellion to him. Why? Because he knows that the best thing for you is to not be in rebellion to him. You are the most fulfilled when you live in connection with the one true God. So Solomon, he begins to disobey God because in his ambition, he marries foreign women, non-Israelites, right? And he marries a lot of them. If you go look at the life of Solomon, he marries a lot of foreign women. And the problem is that these wives he has, they begin to ask him to let them worship their gods from their homes, right? So not only does Solomon begin to condone idol worship, but he actually begins to participate in idol worship. So as as Solomon splits away from what God has commanded him to do, God is patient with Solomon, mostly out of a love for David. But God's anger with Solomon leads to the consequence of the nation of Israel splitting into two separate kingdoms. So right as Solomon dies, because of the idolatry he's produced, the 10 northern tribes become the nation of Israel, and the 2 southern tribes become the nation of Judah. Okay, so now you have a split. And the north pretty much only has evil kings. From here on out, it's just a series of really bad rulers in the north. And the other problem going on at the time is the superpower that's nearby, Syria. Syria was the superpower, and they were incredibly brutal and scary. So in order to try and set themselves up for success, there's a king named Omri. He's a king in the northern 10 tribes, and he marries his son Ahab off to a Phoenician princess, right? So the Phoenicians were the neighbors just to the north of Israel, and he wants to create an alliance with them so that they can band together against the Syrians. So he marries off Ahab, his son, to Jezebel. Yeah, you've heard that name. Look in chapter 16, verse 30. This is just a little bit of background. I'm sorry, 1 Kings. I forgot we don't have it up there. Okay, 1 Kings, chapter 16, verse 30. I'll give you guys a second. All right. So starting in verse 30, again, this is just a little background. It says, Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. And as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal, and worshipped him. So he erected an altar for Baal at the house of Baal, which is built in Samaria. Ahab also made the Asherah. So Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. Okay, so this is what you need to see. Ahab, just like Solomon, he marries a foreign woman, but Ahab takes it a step further. He doesn't just condone idolatry and participate in idolatry. He builds a temple in his capital city to Baal, which was one of the surrounding gods of the foreign religions, right? And so he has now set up a temple to a false god in the very capital of the northern kingdom, in Samaria. This is the height of Israel's sin. This is one of their darkest moments. This is what is going to set up the scene for Elijah to come forward. So as we move forward, I want to give you one more piece of background. We're going to talk about Baal. If you've read a lot of the Old Testament, you've probably heard the name Baal a lot of times. So I wanted to dig into a little bit about who Baal is so we can better understand what this false god represents and what Elijah's challenge is to overcome here. So Baal is a main god in a pantheon of gods that were for the Canaanites and the Phoenician neighbors, okay? Now, the interesting thing about Baal is he's kind of a choose-your-own-adventure type god or choose-your-own god. He took on the personality of whatever city he was being worshipped in. So whatever that city needed or cared about or liked, that became what Baal was representing there. There was only one Baal, there was one mythology for Baal, but because Baal was just kind of a fit-your-own preference, they made it fit the preference of their surroundings. So the Baal that we're looking at in this story, he is the storm god. Okay, so he brings forth the rains and the fertility of the crops and the fertility of the animals and even the fertility of people. He was responsible for bringing the life that sustained their culture. Keep in mind, this is an agricultural society. So a storm god, the god of rain, would be the most important god they could possibly worship. He's the one that kept them moving forward. So every rainy season, they believed that Baal brought the rain. He was the one that brought it so that their crops could grow. But every off season, they believed that the evil god Mot defeated Baal and sent him to the underworld. And that explained the season without rain. And then Every rainy season, Baal had to defeat death, come back, and bring life with him again. And this happened over and over and over again. So another interesting thing about Baal is the way that they worshipped him. One of the main ways that you worshipped the fertility god Baal was that you went to his temple and you had sex with the temple prostitutes. Listen, here's the thing. It's really like they were using their need of rain as an excuse to worship sex. And if you don't think we do this, we have this idol that we call marriage. Now, marriage isn't a bad thing, but you can use your lack of marriage as an excuse to worship sex. We do it all the time. You don't believe me? Let's just review something in popular culture. Tinder is where we all go to tell people we're looking for the one, but somehow the way we find the one is we hook up with everyone. Our culture is constantly using a need or making it into an idol and then worshiping sex. So we are not better than them as a society, right? It sounds weird to us because you don't go to church and have sex, but it's the same concept. So God is going to call Elijah forward to challenge this god Baal. Look in chapter 17, verse 1. Now Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall certainly be neither dew nor rain during these years, except by my word." Okay. Now, one thing you need to know about Old Testament prophets. Old Testament prophets' job was to call the people of Israel back to him. He called the people of Israel back to him, away from false gods, away from idolatry, okay? So, something you need to understand here is the language that Elijah is using. There's a Baal hymn, and in that hymn to Baal, that song that they would sing, the language is, "Lo, the prince, the Lord of the earth exists." Elijah is essentially ripping off this hymn to Baal, and he's replacing it with Yahweh, and he says, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives." They would have understood this to be a direct challenge to Baal just in the opening language of the statement. This is already Elijah saying, "I'm challenging your God with my God." All right? And then the next piece of this is that what is the challenge? He says, "Neither dew nor rain." This is a challenge to the storm god. This is a challenge to the God who brings rain. All right? And not only that, why does he say dew? Something you need to understand. So you see in the Old Testament this phrase about the promised land, it produced milk and honey. Right? It was a phrase that meant it was a fruitful land, it was a productive land. This particular setting is in a place called Jezreel. Jezreel was such a fertile land that they didn't even need rain for their crops to grow. Actually, the morning dew was so thick and heavy that crops would grow just from that. So Elijah's not leaving any room. He's not saying it's not going to rain, and they're like, big deal. He's saying there will be not a drop of water. There will be nothing for your God to provide for you. So again, this is a bold and direct challenge. So what does this first verse say about Elijah? Well, the first thing we see is that Elijah knows God. He has an actual relationship with God. And his relationship with God drives him to care more about what God thinks than what Ahab thinks, or what the culture thinks. He is so distraught over the sin that he sees in his society that he doesn't care about anyone except what his God thinks. He is literally attacking the God of the man who can sentence him to death. Ahab can order him to be killed, and he cares less about his own life and his own safety in that circumstance that he is willing to challenge Baal. This is the definition of reckless abandon. I want you to see right off the bat, verse 1 of chapter 17, we see that Elijah is a man who is concerned with one thing, and that is serving and following God. Now, what we don't seem to have an indication that Elijah was really sent by God here. It's like he just kind of shows up. But in James 5, it says, a prayer of a righteous person, when it is brought about, can accomplish much. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the earth for 3 years and 6 months. Elijah was a man of God who prayed earnestly. Now, when we think of that word earnestly, it means like passionate or like aggressively, but earnestly, when James says it, he means consistently. How often do we ask for something from God? We don't see it immediately and we go, well, I guess I'm not supposed to have that. Elijah was so convicted by the sin in his culture, he went to God consistently to pray for something, to pray that God would rebuke the evil in the land, and God kept it from raining for 3.5 years because that's what Elijah asked him to do. Look in verse 2. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, go away from here and turn eastward, and hide yourself in the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. And it shall be that you will drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to provide food for you there. So he went and did everything according to the word of the Lord. For he went and lived in the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan, and the ravens brought to him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he would drink from the brook. But it happened after a while that the brook dried up, because there was no rain in the land. Okay, I need you to notice what it says in verse 2. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Elijah didn't even have the escape plan before he went and challenged Baal. God had not told him how he was going to provide for him, how he was going to keep him safe. He obeyed God before he knew anything else that was about to happen. We delay obedience all the time because we don't know what's going to happen next. Because God hasn't revealed the next step to us, and we don't trust him enough to take the first step. I got a news flash for you. God doesn't reveal further parts of the plan while you're being disobedient to the part he's already given you. It doesn't work like that. God's not in the business of convincing you that he's trustworthy. He wants you to believe that he's trustworthy. Listen, in our culture, we want God to tell us what he has for our life, especially this age group. This is the age group where you're still figuring stuff out. Where am I going to work? Where should I go to school? What degree should I get? Who should I marry? What car should I buy? How do I save my money? You're figuring that stuff out, and you constantly go, God, why aren't you telling me these things? But here's the reality. God has already given you commands. Explicit, black and white, written in this book. And if you're not doing the stuff he's already told you to do, why is he going to tell you more? Why is he going to give you added things when you're not even doing the first part? It starts right here. And listen, this is not about being perfect, right? This isn't about you never mess up and it's about trusting. It's about trusting that God is who he says he is. That when he says he'll provide for you, he will provide for you so you can walk in faith on that provision, on that promise of provision, even if you don't know the whole plan yet. The next question I have for you about this is, are you using your unmet needs as an excuse for idol worship? Guys, are you using your unmet needs sexually to worship pornography? Ladies, are you using your fear of being alone, even though if you were in the Word with God, you wouldn't be alone, to worship dating? Dating somebody you know isn't who God has for you? The reality is, if you are using an unmet need to worship something that God doesn't have for you, He's not in the business of then coming around the backside of it and fixing that unmet need. You're not even in a position to receive it. You can't get what God has for you because your hands are full of something He doesn't have for you. We do this with everything. How many of you escape from your problems by worshiping social media or video games? The reality is, God doesn't call on you to escape your problems. He calls on you to bring them to Him. You know what happens to your problems when you escape them? They just wait for you. They don't go away. When you take your problems to God, He deals with them. How about tithing? How many of you are too poor to tithe? And yet, you can buy whatever thing you see on Amazon. You can buy whatever video game or energy drink, or how about this? How many of you are too broke to tithe, but somehow you still make it out on the weekend to have a drink? We are constantly not doing the things that God tells us to do explicitly, and then wondering why He's not meeting the excess needs. Your daily bread is in this book, and it's written in black and white. Now, in verse 3, he tells Elijah, hide yourself. I want you to understand this word. This is not a fearful thing. That word hide, it's a specific Hebrew word that in this particular instance, it actually means be not present. Hell is the place where God is not present. On earth, when you're being disciplined, God removes His presence. He gives you a taste of what hell and condemnation are. Now, if you're a Christian, He doesn't remove Himself from you fully, but He will peel back the feeling of Him, enough for you to say, this isn't fulfilling, and I need to seek God. What He's doing here is that He is in full-fledged discipline mode of Israel, and He is telling the physical representation of His presence, His prophet, to withdraw from the people of Israel, to take Himself away so that He can then illustrate to the people of Israel, you're alone. I'm not with you. And this goes all the way back to the beginning. They were not in relationship with God at this moment. They were in relationship with Baal. And God wasn't going to bless that. Now, the other thing I want to point out is this word. My version says brook. Some of your versions may say wadi. Wadi's actually better. If you Google brook, you're going to find like little babbling brooks in the forest. If you Google wadi, you're going to find giant cavern ravines in the desert that have rivers running through them. That's a more accurate representation of where Elijah is withdrawing to. He's gone to kind of a cavern place. It's Wadi. I see some of you Googling it. So look up wadis. That it gives you a better picture of exactly where Elijah is going right now. So he goes to live in this wadi, and God provides bread and meat. With what? Ravens. That doesn't even make sense. I don't know if you've ever tried to take food from a bird, but it doesn't go well. Like, that's not something that you do on a daily basis. So the reality is this: God is commanding birds to bring Him food twice a day. Listen, part of the problem is, the reason that we can't understand how God's going to provide for us is that we confine Him to the methods that fit in our brain. Let me use myself on this one. When God called me to be a pastor, I said, but God, how are you going to provide for me? It didn't make sense because I was confining to God the salary that I could see. And I was saying, God, like, I don't get it. I don't get how you're going to do this. And God took me to the passage where Jesus sends Peter out and He says, go fishing. When you catch the fish, I want you to pull the coins out of its mouth, and that's how you're going to go pay our taxes. See, God doesn't have to provide for us in the way that fits into our brain. He's the God of all the universe. If I understand God, I'm not paying attention to the right God. And the reality is, Why would I tell a supernatural God that he has to provide for me in only the natural ways that I can understand? He is sending ravens. You need to trust God. Trust that he'll provide in ways that you can't even begin to understand or explain. But notice this. Where was Elijah's provision? It was where God told him to be. He didn't get to choose the venue. Like, well, God, desert Wadi, not really my thing. I was thinking beaches, white sands. That's where I want to go. Provide for me there. That's not how this works. God provides where he tells you to be. And if you're there, you find God's provision, and it is great. And then it dries up. Why does it dry up? A lot of times in our lives, God withdraws blessings so that he can move us. Why would I leave if I have everything I need right here, right in front of me? I begin to idolize the blessing instead of the blesser. And God goes, I'm going to withdraw this to make it easier for you to move on to the next thing I have for you. But what do? We panic. A lot of times we get mad because God took away the blessing that he provided in the first place. It came from God, and you're mad because he's ready for you to move on, so he took it away. The last thing I want you to see here is, do you know how you become a better follower of Jesus? A better follower of God? You learn to follow him through trials and wildernesses. Elijah goes to a wilderness. I want you to understand just how prevalent this is in the Bible. This is literally every major character. Abraham wanders for a long time, just following God and being tested till he can grow to be the man of God that God has for him to be. Joseph literally goes to prison, and God grows him up into the man he's supposed to be. Moses, he's a shepherd in the desert for a long time, and then, even after that, he gets the people of Israel, and the people of Israel have to wander through the wilderness. They have to learn to be God's people in the wilderness. David spends all of 1 Samuel hiding in caves so Saul won't kill him. And what does Jesus do at the beginning of his ministry? He goes into the wilderness to face trials, to face temptations. Listen, if somebody tries to sell you a version of the Christian life that doesn't involve a wilderness, they are lying to you. In order for you to be the man or woman of God that you've been called to be, there's a wilderness experience. And a lot of times, you don't experience it the way you should because you're still clutching on to something that God never had for you in the first place. Look in verse 8. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to provide food for you. So he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the entrance of the city, behold, a widow was gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, Please, get me a little water in a cup, so that I may drink. As she was going to get it, he called to her and said, Please, bring me a piece of bread in your hand. But she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have no food, only a handful of flour in a bowl, and a little oil in a jar. And behold, I'm gathering a few sticks, so that I may go in and prepare it for me and my son, so that we may eat it and die. However, Elijah said to her, Do not fear. Go do as I have said, or go do as you have said. Just make me a little bread loaf from it first, and bring it out to me. And afterward you may make one for yourself and for your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The bowl of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil become empty, until the day that the Lord provides rain on the face of the earth. So she went and did everything in accordance with the word of Elijah. And she and he and her household ate for many days. The bowl of flour was not used up, nor did the jar of oil become empty, in accordance with the word of the Lord which he had spoken through Elijah. So God tells Elijah to go to Zarephath. The first thing I need you to know about that is a city in Phoenician territory. This is not a small detail. God is sending Elijah, the man who has threatened and challenged Baal, into Baal's home turf to show that Baal has absolutely no power. Baal can't stop Elijah from living there. He can't stop Elijah from prospering there. He can't even stop Elijah from doing miracles there, and he can't find him there. Baal has no power in this situation, and God is ensuring that that is apparent. The second thing here is he sent him to a widow. Okay, this is not 2022. This is a widow in ancient times. This widow couldn't provide for a full-grown man without a famine. Now add a famine. God is sending Elijah to somebody who can barely provide for herself, and she has a son. And the famine's already gotten so bad at this point, when Elijah shows up, she's like ready to die. She has hit full-fledged desperation, and she's going, well, I guess we've got one last meal. I have no idea where it's coming from after that, so we'll make a day of it, and then we'll die. And that's all she's got left. But keep in mind, this widow isn't even an Israelite. God uses who's available. If you think that God's going to pick you because you're an American, you are sadly mistaken. God doesn't care where you were born. God cares only if you are in a relationship with Him. He asks her for water. This is a small test. We see this test in a couple places in the Bible. This is a test of her willingness. Something easy to do. Get me some water. So in the Old Testament, there's a story where a servant is sent to go find a wife. He finds the wife Rebecca. But when he first meets her, he asks her to water his camels and himself. It's a test of her willingness. We see this again when Jesus comes to the Samaritan woman at the well and says, can I have some water? This is just a simple cultural test to see if this person is willing, right? But then what happens? As she begins to go away, he ups the ante. He gives her the big test and also some bread. He knows, he's not unaware that there's a famine going on. He asks her for some bread. He is trying to identify if this is the woman that God has sent to provide for him. Now, she explains her desperation, right? She voices what her situation is, but what does she ultimately do? She obeys. She acts in that faith. And then look at what happens when she acts in that faith. God provides. God comes through. The whole point of the verse 16 is to show you that because God said it, it happened. That's all the way through the Bible. There are promises all the way through this book, not just for the people that are written about, but for us as God's children. And when God says that He will do something, He always does it. Now, this widow, she's desperate, and actually that's to her advantage, because the entire point of this story that we're looking at right now is that self-sustaining is a lie. That is the point of chapter 17 of 1 Kings. Baal is the image of self-sustaining. It's a shape your own God, worship your own idols, get the things you want. Self-sustainment is a lie. Desperation is what allows God to sustain us in a real way. This widow was desperate, and because she was desperate, she was ready to be sustained by God. Notice in verse 15, it says she did everything. Everything. Stop doing the Christian life halfway. Stop half-stepping this system. God has given you commands, and He's promised to fulfill you if you're walking in relationship with Him, but He's waiting for you to stop half-stepping. He's waiting for you to stop looking back and pretending to move forward. The people of Israel, when they came out of slavery in Egypt, they went into the wilderness, and what did they do? They constantly said, man, it would have been better to die back in Egypt. It would have been better to just stay in slavery. And then they even went so far as to reminisce about the bad conditions that were back then. God has a beach for you if you will stop playing in your mud puddle. You're so focused on this right in front of you, you won't just let God provide. Stop having a plan B. Here's the question. Do you or do you not believe this? Because if you believe this, are you going to spend the rest of your life half in and half out? Are you going to dive in and let God show you His provision? Again, verse 16 is there on purpose. The story could end after verse 15 because we see that they eat. But the reason verse 16 is there is to emphasize why this happens. It happens because God said it would, because He's reliable. Look in verse 17. Now it happened after these things that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became sick, and his condition became very grave until at the end he was no longer breathing. So she said to Elijah, "Why is my business any of yours, you, man of God? Yet you have come to me to bring my wrongdoings to remembrance and to put my son to death." But he said to her, "Give me your son." Then he took him up from her arms and carried him up to the upstairs room where he was living, and he laid him down on his own bed. And he called to the Lord and said, "Lord, my God, have you also brought catastrophe upon the widow with whom I am staying by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out over the boy 3 times, and he called to the Lord and said, "Lord, my God, please let this boy's life return to him." And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah, and the life of the boy returned to him, and he revived. Elijah then took the boy and brought him down from the upstairs room in the house and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." Listen, God builds our faith. It's not perfect. It's not probably ever going to be perfect, right? I mean, it will be on the last day. But this widow, she's seen some good things of God. She's seen God provide. But she's in grief in this moment. She's voicing frustration and grief. And Elijah, by the way, Elijah is still in the process of training and gaining credibility, right? So Elijah is in a phase of practice tests. You can see this for Old Testament characters as well. It's like they are built up by God, sometimes in a lot of failures, before they get to the place where they can face the test they have. This is the next level for Elijah. First, he put his life on the line. He went and challenged Baal before the king. Then he has to trust God that birds are going to bring him food in the wilderness. Then he has to trust God that a widow in the ancient world is going to provide for him. And finally now, he has to trust God with life and death of someone else. This is also, keep in mind, this is written to an audience at the time. Elijah is being demonstrated to be credible as a man of God. The people of Israel are seeing that Elijah is sent by God. He's not a false prophet. And in verse 20, Elijah is having a crisis of faith. Listen, you won't always understand exactly what's going on. You won't always understand exactly what God is doing. But look at what Elijah did. The first thing Elijah does when he doesn't understand the situation is he takes it straight to God. We don't understand what's going on, so instead of approaching God and saying, "God, I need help with this. I don't get it," we just get angry and pout. We give God the silent treatment. That's not how good relationships function. And then notice in 21, Elijah doesn't make excuses for God. How often do you pray like this? Lord, this is what I want, but if you don't want that, that's okay. That'll be fine. Why? Because you're afraid of God failing. You're afraid of God not coming through. The reality is Elijah, he was ready to see God move. He was acting based on who he knew God to be. He understood that God is merciful and just and good. And he's acting on his understanding of God's character. Do you know what is the prerequisite, though, for that kind of miracle? You have to know who God is. Elijah, from the very beginning, we see that he knows God. He's in a relationship with God. And every step of the way, that knowledge of God has been grown and strengthened and fleshed out. And so, because he knows God, he's able to act. You have to have spent enough time with God to know him. Listen, we use the word abide around here a lot. Abide, remain, be with God, right? But you know what the side effect of that time spent abiding is? It's not just that you know God, but it's that you know what God wants when God wants it. Elijah understood what God's desire was in this moment. Now, my version says he stretched himself out over the boy. Some of your versions might say that he stretched his arms out over the boy. I read a theory that this is some kind of ancient form of CPR that's happening here. None of that matters. The point is this. Elijah acted. He acted. He did something. He didn't just sit around, throw his hands up and go, I guess God's going to have to take care of it. He said, God, take care of it. And then he moved. Now look at verse 24 again. Then the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. All right, the widow had already seen miracles, right? She'd already seen this infinite bread jar, and somehow it's now that she believes that Elijah is from God. Listen, this woman has grown up her whole life, and she's been told that Baal brings fertility, that Baal brings life, that Baal produces the rains and the crops and the animals. But no matter what she's heard about Baal, she has never seen Baal do something like what she just saw happen. She saw God bring death and reverse it into life. Our God brings life. This is the only God. This is the only true God, and this God brings with him life. And not only that, but he did it on Baal's turf. He did it to demonstrate that Baal has no power in this situation. Look at chapter 18, verse 1. Now it happened after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go present yourself to Ahab, and I will provide rain on the face of the earth. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. If you have spent a lot of time in the Bible, you may know what chapter 18 is about. Elijah has gone through test after test after test, and God is sending him back to the people who are looking for him to kill him, because it's time for Elijah to have a showdown. Elijah is going to confront Baal, and there is going to be a violent encounter between God and Baal, and we're going to see who has truth, who has power. Are you in the business of getting ready for what God has for you? God has big things in store for you. God has Mount Carmel showdowns. God has challenges and things He wants you to face, and He wants to face with you, and He wants to show you His provision. But as long as you're living this life half in and half out, God's not using you. He's not training you the way that you need to be trained to face those things. Begin to be in a place where you spend so much time with God. You know who God is, what He wants, when He wants it. You're doing the things that are written in black and white. That way, when you go up to Mount Carmel and you face the situation that God has for you to face that is overwhelming, you have been tested and tried and built up, and you're ready to face it. Next week, we're going to talk about that show.
Hey guys, this is Philip Jackson, pastor to young adults at Evergreen Baptist Church. I want to invite you to come to Reach. We meet every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at Evergreen Church in South Tulsa, just east of Mingo on 111th Street. The mission of Reach Tulsa is to cultivate a young adult community that's defined by real transformation and the sincere pursuit of a godly life through training in biblical disciplines, personal development, and intentionally transitioning into independence as mature members of the body of Christ. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe to our content. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Reach Young Adult Ministry is a part of Evergreen Baptist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For more information and additional lessons, please visit our website, evergreenbc.org.